Hi there, crafter! Today, for this week's Crochet Friday, I am going to be showing you how to cross stitch onto Tunisian crochet. So my inspiration for this idea is coming from this blanket that my great-grandmother made. And this is actually, I believe, a Mary Maxim pattern, and I think the original pattern might have just been like a single crochet graph. But what my great-grandmother did when she made this blanket is she went ahead and Tunisian crocheted, and then she cross-stitched the different pictures onto the Tunisian crochet blanket. So I thought, hey, this looks like a fun idea, and I decided to do a tutorial on how you can make some really cool cross-stitch patterns on Tunisian crochet. Step one for making a cross stitch using Tunisian crochet is to first of all create our Tunisian crochet piece that's going to be kind of like our cross stitch fabric that then we will sew our pattern onto. So first of all, you will need to pick a pattern. So I'm going to do this little anchor pattern that I found on hobbyloco.com, and the creator of that website has graciously made a bunch of cross stitch graphics available for free, so thank you so much for that resource. Since I didn't create the graph that I'm going to be using, I'm not going to show the graph itself on the camera, but I'll talk you through my process. So first of all, you want to look at your graph and figure out how many blocks wide by how many blocks tall your graph is. So for me, the pattern I decided to do is 15 blocks of cross stitch wide by 20 blocks tall. So we're essentially going to Tunisian crochet to create a grid that will be the right size. So for me, that's going to be 15 blocks across and 20 blocks tall. Now, really important, because our cross stitch will be done in the spaces between the stitches, not on the actual stitches themselves, when we make our starting chain, we're going to need one more stitch than number of blocks. Let me explain what I mean. In my case, I want to have 15 blocks wide, so I'm going to need it to be 16 stitches wide. So I'm going to start by chaining 16, 13, 14, 15, 16. And then I like picking up in the back loops, and I'm just gonna go ahead and pick up an additional 15 loops. So I've got 16 loops on my hook, 16 stitches, and I'm just going to work the return pass like normal. So here's my first row, and I have 16 stitches wide, and by having 16 stitches, this is going to create 15 blocks, and the blocks will basically be the spaces between the posts, and they'll be the height of one row. So now I've got my width. Now I need to do 20 rows, and I'm just going to do a Tunisian simple stitch. So I'm going to do 19 more rows, and then I'll meet you back here, and we will start working on the cross stitch. So here's my rectangle that I have Tunisian crocheted using just the Tunisian simple stitch, and this is the size I need for my graph. Now what's also really helpful is if you do a single crochet border around it, because right now it's curling a lot, but if you do a border on it, it helps it not curl quite so much. But I'm going to make my anchor be blue, so I've got this blue yarn here, and as with cross stitch, you can use different plies of yarn to get different thicknesses. So this is a red heart yarn, and this is a 4-ply yarn. So you can either cross stitch on with the whole big thick piece of yarn, or you can undo the ply and use just one of these if you want it to be thinner. And that's really similar to what we do with normal cross stitch, where if we have multi-ply thread, we can undo the ply and just use 1 ply or 2 ply and just get whatever thickness we want. So for me, I'm going to just use the full thickness of the yarn for my cross stitches themselves, and then I'm going to do a border with just probably a 1 ply, maybe a 2 ply. So we obviously need our color that we will be cross stitching on there, and you can do multiple colors, of course, depending on your pattern. You'll want a tapestry needle. Personally, I like this big metal one because it goes through the fabric really easily, and I've broken several of my plastic ones, so it's just a little more durable. And then I'll use some scissors here. But it's gonna be pretty straightforward if you've ever cross-stitched before. I'm gonna show you how I'm cross-stitching onto here. If you want pointers for cross-stitch in general, I would just do a search here on YouTube for videos on cross-stitch in general, but I'm gonna show you specifically how to do it and where to work on the Tunisian crochet. So I'm gonna start by just cutting myself a long piece of yarn. And I like doing longer pieces because we will have yarn showing through on the back, and we will have to tie it off, and the longer you go, the less ends you have to tie off. I'm gonna put this on my hook, and let's zoom in and look at our Tunisian crochet so we can see exactly where we need to work. So if we look at our Tunisian crochet, especially if we kind of stretch it, you can kind of see these little holes opening. And where these holes open is at the post of every stitch, kind of right under the top of the post. There's a hole there. If you look at the stitch below it, again, look right for that post, and then to the right of it, there will be a hole there. And it's basically where we work a stitch into the stitch from the previous row. That's basically where we're going to work. So based on my pattern, I'm looking at where I need to start, and I'm just kind of guesstimating. You can of course count this out, but I think it's going to be right around this stitch here. It's going to be my top space, my first one. So I'm going to come from the back through this spot right here, and it's where this post has been pulled up by the next post being worked in it. Come through right there, and I'm going to leave a little tail in the back, and then we're going to go over to the next post and work at the bottom section. So you can think of it if you go down a row and over a stitch. We're going to work right in there. So again, here's a post, here's the hole created by the post above it being worked. We're going to go right down through there. And pull our slack through, and I'll finish off this actual cross stitch here. Normally I do it where I'll do a whole bunch running this way, and then I'll come back through and do the other ones crossing over it. But so that you can see exactly where I'm working, I'll show you me coming back along the other direction for the cross part of the stitch. So now I need to come back up through one space above where I went in here. So that's going to be this spot right here. So we went in basically the top of this post for the bottom. So we're going to go one post above it and come up through the space that's right there. And the more you do this, the more you'll get the hang of exactly where to work. Then the spot I need to go down is I'm going to find the post of my first spot where I very first started and find the post right beneath it. So we worked on the top of this post. We're going to now work in the top of this post, which is this spot right here. Pull that slack through, and that is how our cross stitches will look in this fabric. So hopefully that gives you an idea of exactly where we're working. All of our spots where we work is always the top space created by the post of a Tunisian simple stitch. So right here would be a place where we run our needle through. We find this one, it'd be right here. Here's the space below that, to the left, space above it. And the more you do this, the easier it is to see exactly where you need to work. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish cross stitching my pattern. So I need to do another cross right here. So that's the top of my cross. So I'm going to go down a row and over a stitch. So I worked in this post here, so go down a row, over a stitch, work in the top of that post. And then to come back up, I'm going to come in that same spot of the stitch from the other one. Already worked through that spot, pull it up. Finish it off, we're gonna find where we very first started and go down a stitch and go in right here at the top of that post. So again, I went in the top of this post here, so I'm going to go down a row and over a post and go right through the top, right there. And then for the cross stitch over top of it, I worked on the top of this post, so we're going to go up a post, work right in that spot there. And then we work in the top of that post, we're going to come down a row and work in the top of that post. A little gap there created by the stitch above it being worked in it. So that's how we work the basic cross stitch. Now with this particular pattern, it also calls for some half stitching. So basically meaning it would come to the middle and just go through the center there. So if you want to find kind of like the mid part of a stitch, it's going to be this space created by the two vertical bars. So right there. So I'm going to come up through there. That's the very center of a space. So it'd be the spot that's equivalent to where they cross right here, to where they cross here, and to where they cross here. And now it needs to be worked halfway down into there. So this is basically coming from the center and just working kind of a half stitch across one of our spaces. I also need one on the other side. So again, I'm just going to come up in between those two horizontal bars. Okay, that's the center of a stitch spot. And this one needs to lay right across here. So I'm just going to find the spot where I've already worked. It's the top of the stitch in the row below. And go out through there. And that's how you can work those half cross stitches in there. So I've done the top part of my anchor and coming down, but I've still got to do this bottom part. But I find myself with my tail way up here. So something you can do, instead of leaving the tail laying, you know, on the back where it could catch and get snagged, is if you're trying to move your working tail end further down, you can run it through the fabric itself. So I need to end up down here, so I am going to run this through the fabric itself. Check from the front to make sure it's not sticking through anywhere, and it's not. And now this way, whenever I start working over here, I'll only have a little bit of a run on the back versus a big long run from the top to the bottom. One more thing I'll show you before we get to the outlining of our project is what to do when you're running out of yarn. So I like to leave myself a longer tail just because it's easier to work with, but we're just going to tie it off. You can either go around, you know, the Tunisian crochet stitching itself, you can go around the yarn that you've stitched onto here. Either way doesn't make a difference. So we're going to wrap it around through and then tie it off. And you can do multiple knots, so if this were a blanket you'd probably want your knots to be more secure. This I'm not so worried about the tails coming loose. So once I've got it knotted off, I'm just going to run my needle under the fabric a little ways and put my tail back onto my needle. Pull it through. Make sure everything looks good from the front. I'm not, you know, pulling this crazy tight or anything. And then if it's good, I will just trim that tail end off. Let me show you one more thing when you're cross stitching that might make it a little easier for you. So when you're coming from the back, I personally have a harder time with it because it's hard to make sure you come to the right spot, and a lot of times you end up splitting the yarn. And you don't want it to split the yarn, you want it to go through the hole. So what I like to do to make it easier is I'll come to the front and I'll put my hook or my needle into that spot where it's going to go. I'll just kind of wiggle it around because it's easier to get it lined up from the front. And now I have a bigger hole that I can come right through with my needle, and it makes it easier to come through and less likely that I will end up splitting the yarn. So that's just a little tip to make things a bit easier. So I finished the cross stitching. Now I'm going to add a border to this, like around my picture. And to do the border, I'm going to use 2-ply of my yarn. So I'm going to basically come to the end of my yarn here. And you can kind of do this number with it, where if you kind of push it down, and if you grab a little further up, grab at the end, push down and twist, you can get the ply to separate. Just going to carefully untwist it all the way along. Now these pieces will be a bit wavy when it's all said and done. I like to work a little section at a time and then I'll let the twist out at the end of the yarn so that you don't end up with a big snarl. 2 long pieces of 2-ply yarn. And this is going to be really similar to what we've been doing so far. I'm going to put it on my needle, start in the back. I'm going to start with this inside section here. And again, I'll leave a tail on the back end there. And start stitching around. I like to do where I come up and then down, up and then down, up and then down. So basically I go to the end of my next stitch, come up through there, and down here. So the next spot I want to work is this side right along here, so I'm going to go to my far point, come up there, and down at the base, and that's because the spot where I'm going in right now is the spot where I finished my previous stitch. So if I went right back through there, I would just undo the stitch I had done. And so basically all I'm doing is I'm going in the same spots that I do when I am working the cross stitches themselves. Going up one, down the other, and just working along to fill it in. I'll do a long run here from down here up to here. Then along the side, going right below here. Back up there. Down here. Up to here. I'm just going to keep going around, basically creating this border. And once I finish going all the way around, I'll tie it off in the back and weave my ends in, and then I'll show you when I'm done. And here is my finished little cross stitch. Here's the back. And as with normal cross stitch, the back can get a little messy, but what's nice is we're at least able to weave the tail ends through the fabric itself, so we don't have these big knots and tails sticking off all over the back because we're able to weave them into the fabric itself. But this is a great way to add some detail to either blankets or pillow covers. The crochet Tunisian stitching itself isn't that complicated, but you can do whatever kind of design you want with the cross stitch method. This also works really well for things like pillow covers, if you want to put some pretty designs. And of course your cross stitch designs can be super simple like this one, or you can find some really complex ones that are really elaborate, and those would turn out super pretty as well. But I hope y'all enjoyed learning this process. Make sure to leave a thumbs up on the video if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much for watching, and happy crafting!